the night before, but I did start thinking, okay, why was I not an idiot the next day? Why was I not reckless? Why was I not a danger to myself and others? And it's because of my perspective. You see, I don't know what was up with that car. Maybe they had something important going on. I really have no idea. Maybe they, just wanted some excitement and they were driving quickly. People didn't know my story the next morning. Maybe they thought, I was just crazy and I was just being erratic, but really I was running behind. And, and I was yelling at people like, why won't you go faster? I'm like, don't you know? Like, you're going the speed limit, which means you're going slow. Like, everyone goes over on this road. But I had no fault with myself on that day. And that's because of perspective. So today we're looking at, first off, the perspective of others. And I want you on your paper, I want you to name a time recently that you might have judged someone or thought something about them. This doesn't have to be too deep. It can be something small, like maybe you just noticed someone driving and you thought like, oh, what are they doing? Or maybe you watched someone in public and you just had a thought about them, maybe the way they looked or maybe an action they did. Or if you have time, I'm going to keep letting you write for a bit. Or on a deeper level, maybe you did. Maybe you had an argument with someone, and I want you to write down maybe kind of what you thought about them, what kind of perception you had of that person. How did you judge them? Just take a moment to do that. Now I wonder, did that perception you had, that judgment, did it help the situation? No? Did it help it at any way? Did it change anything? If you didn't respond or didn't even engage with this person, if it was just someone in a car driving by, what you thought about them, did it help the way you drove? Did it help what you thought? Chances are no. Because see, most problems come from a lack of understanding. Those of you that are married should know that, right? How many times do you have an argument with someone and it's just miscommunication? You see, I studied communication when I was in school, and it's not like my most passionate thing, but I went to it because I wanted to learn more about it. I felt like I needed more help in that field, and it blew my mind. Just we would study the perception of people. We did like a whole thing about just looking at the way we think and what we assume about people. And one of those things was about miscommunication. And so like with marriages, like I can't even remember what the percentage is, but it's the majority of marriages, the issues come from miscommunication. The majority of divorces eventually, they come from money, but they also come from miscommunication about all of those topics. And so most of our problems in life come from us just not understanding what the other side's story is. We assume that our side is the true side. And I want you to look at this. Consider the biggest topics of 2020. All of the things that's been going on this year. What do you think needed more perspective? You can say it. Presidential race. What else? COVID. And we had so much going on this year. Anything else? Job losses, yeah. Another example of perspective, when I first was writing this slide, I wrote down race relations. That's been a big topic this year. But as an example of my false perspective, instead of saying consider the biggest topics of 2020, I had written down consider the biggest problems of 2020. And then I realized that race relations and those issues are not a 2020 problem. It's been a problem all of life. And I thought to myself, wow, I didn't think that at first, because that doesn't affect me as much. That's my perspective. And so perspective is something that we have to actively pursue, actively engage in. And a lot of that comes with information. It comes from talking to other people and understanding the other side of things. And one of those is reframing. So reframing, there's two different examples of reframing. One of those is like in debates or in arguments. They teach you reframing is a good way to win because you grab someone's perspective, you figure out what their side of the thing is, and then you connect it with your point. So that when you give your argument, they kind of look at it and they're like, oh, okay, now I can kind of like see your direction and you can win. I'm not here to talk to you about winning. I'm here to talk to you about reframing our life and how we view people and how we talk to the people that we know. See, if you look it up, reframing comes up as being listed as therapy's biggest tool. The reason people go to therapy is sometimes they need help in their life and sometimes they need another side of the story. And a lot of times, if you start telling an event that happened to you, it's hard for you to really see maybe the positive side of things. It's hard for you to realize, what lesson you could have learned from that. And you need another voice from another person to come in and say, okay, well, maybe they meant it this way, or maybe this happened in your life so that this could happen. And so it's actually therapy's biggest tool, that cognitive reframing is a psychological technique that consists of identifying and then changing the way situations, experiences, events, ideas, and emotions are viewed. It's the process by which such situations or thoughts are challenged and then changed. It's looking at one thing that happened and realizing, okay, how can we spin this? How can we look at it? How can we advertise it? How can we see something that's happening to us and say, okay, well, maybe God is using this event in my life for this purpose, even though I feel like it's hitting me in this way. Maybe it's meant to come in a different way. Like maybe today I was thinking, okay, well, my main session's going to be first, because then I feel more like passionate about that, and then I'll have my breakout later. But maybe it's switched so that I can be warmed up and I can have a better session later. I don't know. But so let's practice reframing. I want you to go back to that first question I asked, where you wrote down a time that you judged someone or thought something. And now I want you to practice reframing. I want you to take what you saw, what you thought about that person, and come up with a reason why they might have done what they did. I want you to come up with an explanation of maybe why that event happened, or maybe why you thought that way. Take a moment to do that. If you didn't write something down earlier, come up with something now. Now, you don't have to share, but if anyone wants to, feel free to shout out what you came up with. I was checking the live stream so I can chat, but it's a little weird, me talking on there while I'm up here. So the thing about this is, if we're going to consistently work on our perspective, or if we're going to have the right perspective, this is going to be something that we have to consistently practice. It's not going to be something that we just come up with the very next day. It's going to be something that we have to consciously be aware of what we're thinking about people and what we're saying to them. And through this is not just practice in coming up with excuses. This is practice in just realizing how we connect to others and how we can engage with them. Because you might say, okay, well, we make excuses for people. It's all fine and dandy what you're telling me here, but this is just coming up with excuses, and that's not true. What I want to say is we're not making excuses for people. We're extending grace to people. You see, it is so easy for us to make excuses for ourselves, but not so much for us to do for other people. It's so easy for us to give grace to ourselves and say, okay, well, I was just in a bad mood, so it was okay. I was late, so it was okay. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, it was okay. And yet when someone else is behaving in the exact same way we are, it's an issue. We have to extend grace to other people. Let's look at 1 Peter 4, 8 through 10. It says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling, as each has received a gift. Use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. See, what this is saying is that God has blessed us with grace. We have each received a gift, and because we have received that gift, it is now up to us to serve one another and extend that gift and that grace to someone else. See, we have to be focused on others. Other care, not self-oriented. And I list it in this way. You might think this is a weird way of saying that, but I listed it as other care and not self-oriented exactly because I love it. See, this is great. I love it when like science and church can work together. But I was doing some research and I was reading these reports, and I love it. I love it when things just prove the same kind of stuff that we've been preaching for a while. See, a year ago, probably around this time, I think it was a year ago in October, I was speaking about anxiety. And I was talking about how, research was saying that one of the best cures for anxiety was meditation. And I was like, well, we've been preaching that. We've been preaching prayer and meditating on His Word. We know that, to cast all our anxieties on Him, it's the same thing. And now research is saying, okay, well, we've been preaching it for a while, but here's what you should do, and it's the exact same thing. And so this new report came out, and it was saying that the people that are the happiest are the ones that focus more on other care and not being self-oriented. And I love that they were saying that the people that had the most happiness in life were those that started to focus on other people, helping other people, thinking about other people, caring for other people, and less about themselves. The same report also said the other people that were the most happiest were those that were more grateful, that those that spent every day writing down 1 to 3 things that they were grateful for. And by doing that, it made them more thankful and it made them a lot more happier. And I love it because, the Bible tells us to do these things. The Bible tells us to focus on others, to love one another, not ourselves. The Bible tells us to be grateful and to thank God for all that He gives us. And here, it's just proving that. And that's part of what we have to do today, is that we have to care about others. We have to understand their story, because stories matter. I mean, take the emotional moment that we had this morning with Stacy. That was a new perspective, right? A new thought that you might not have known, maybe something you didn't think about before. And after hearing that, maybe you now have a new perspective because you did not know the full story, and now you do. See, you have to focus on others, but you also have to have a perspective of yourself. I want you to name a time where you felt like people perceived you the wrong way or didn't understand a situation you were involved in. Go ahead and write that down. A time where you felt like people thought the wrong thing about you. A time where you did something and maybe they took it the wrong way, or maybe you made a joke and someone took it personally, or you were behaving in some kind of manner and they understood it in a different way. They had the wrong perception of you. I want you to write that down. You have to work on the perspective of yourself. And a lot of times, our personal perspective changes when we start to perceive other people differently. All of these slides today, all of these points, they all kind of come back to the same main thing about praying to God, understanding others, and gaining a new perspective. And I want to challenge you that a lot of times the way you perceive yourself is shaped in the way that you perceive other people. Let me explain. A lot of times when you start judging the way you look, maybe it's because you think people are looking at you and they, they're looking at me and they think this and they think that. Maybe the only reason you think that is because you think those things about other people. I know that's a hard truth to hear, but our personal perspective changes when we perceive others differently. That's like 2 slides ahead, George, if you want to skip some. We judge ourselves in the ways that we judge other people. Another one. Or 2 more.
One, 2.
Is it messing up? No. We need like 2 more ahead. There we go. Now we're back on track. We judge ourselves in the way we judge other people. I have found that I have people around me that, you always have thoughts that come to you, and even I still have thoughts that come to me where I'm like, oh, well, like I didn't shave this morning, and they're going to think this when I'm on stage, or, I'm driving and I did something weird. These people are probably going to think I'm dumb. I missed a turn. I did this. I did that. My license plate on my car, I did not get the one that says, God bless us, or in God we trust. I got one that has my county on it. And it's not because I don't trust in God, but it's more so because I drive all over the place, and I feel like I am less critical of people when I know they're not from around here. If there's a car in front of me and I see that it's some really far out place, I'm like, okay, well, they don't know. Like, this is a keep moving, but they don't know. The sign's probably gone. They're not aware of that. And so I do that on my car too, because I think maybe there's a chance someone else thinks like I do. Maybe when I'm driving around here, they'll see my car and they're like, oh, well, he's not from here. He doesn't know. Like, he doesn't know the speed limit. He doesn't know this. And I can take the liberty to drive however I want because they know I'm not from here. And I find that that is a judgment, and that is the judgment I do, and it's a judgment I feel because that's how I judge other people. And a lot of times, people are thinking okay, well, so and so is probably over there looking at me thinking about this. People don't think about you quite as much as you think they do. People don't care. Honestly, if you're in a store, I can't place an image of a single person that I've seen in a store in the last week. Maybe that's me and I'm not looking at people as much, or maybe it's masks. I don't know. But, why do we go places and we think everyone's looking at me? Everyone's thinking this. Maybe it's because we are looking at other people and we are being critical of them. The reason we are harsh on ourselves is because we expect others are doing the same thing to us. I basically said the same 3 things and worded them differently on all these slides, but I wanted to get this point across because I think it's the most important part of perceiving ourselves is focusing on our perspective of others. And then the other perspective of ourselves is we have to remember who we are and where we came from. All too often we start thinking we're broken. We start thinking we're too far gone. And then that comes into our perspective of God and God's perspective of us, that God's looking at us and he's like, no, you can always come back home. I'm waiting for you. We have the wrong perspective. Let's look at Psalm 139, 13 through 15. It says, for you, does anyone know this? This is probably a memory verse. Part of it is. Al's been getting the memory verses every Sunday. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. It's a great reminder for us to have because so often we start getting into this downward slope of just looking at the negative side of our life and just focusing on that, and we just start thinking we're just too screwed up, we're just too messed up, we don't look the way we want to look, we don't act the way we want to act, we don't do the things we want to do. And we forget that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. We forget that God has a plan and a destiny and a goal set for us, that we've got a home stretch in front of us, and that God is working on us. And I love how last night we had 2 similar topics, and I love that it did not become a topic of we're too similar or a topic of, stealing from one another. Right? Just kidding. But instead, it was given the perception of God working together, that God trying to just nail a point home to us, that they all work together to deliver such a similar goal and a similar topic, but with 2 different perceptions, 2 different ways to perceive the home stretch, and yet we learn something from both of them. And I think that is just so important. But I want to warn you, with getting into this perspective of yourself, I want to warn you to not take it too far. Because at the end of the day, we still have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And we can get to this point to where maybe we're trying to overcorrect, and we start thinking too good about ourselves. And we start forgetting that we are indeed messed up. We know that's not all there is to us, and we know that we are still redeemed and washed by the blood of Christ, but we still sin on the regular, every day. And I want to read you 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. It says, "But understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, and having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people." What was one of those first warnings in there? For people will be lovers of self. See, the Apostle Paul warns that in the last days, people will be lovers of self rather than lovers of God. And so we get into this weird, sticky situation where we want to preach on self-love. And I gave just a glimpse of that today, that I want to say, like, you are indeed created by God, and you are a child of His, and you are loved by Him. But you can't get to the point to where you are just focused all on yourself, that everything is about you. It's not. You can't be a lover of self. So I wonder, how do you perceive yourself? How do you think people perceive you? And how does God perceive you? Take a moment to answer each of those, and I want you to be honest. I want you to think about this. I don't know how people perceive me. I'm pretty sarcastic sometimes, and I hope that everyone understands that. Because I always have this fear, like maybe my perception of myself is that, sometimes it's funny. Sometimes they know I'm, being sarcastic, but maybe everyone just thinks I'm mean. I don't know. I want you to write down, what do you think about yourself, and how do you think, does that line up with how people perceive you? Take a brief moment to write that down.
I think you're funny, Trevor.
Thank you. I think you're funny.
I think that you like traveling. I think
do.
that you care about people. And, yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
and that you're cool.
That's the most important part.
And that George said you've been growing, and you have the hair and...
Oh, the hair.
Yeah.
It's too long. It's too long. I'm not allowed to cut it.
Uh-oh. It's all right.
Yeah. But how do you perceive yourself? See, a few weeks ago, or it could have been a month, after COVID, I lost track of days. I don't even look at the calendar much anymore. But we had the staff come up, and we had the staff speak about how they were impacted by coronavirus. And Darren came up and he spoke about how, he had times of depression. And Stacy came up and spoke about how she just missed connection, and she just had, such a lapse, and, she needed to be an extrovert and talk to people, and she just felt so disconnected. And Katrina came up and talked about how, she's kind of introverted, but she became happy and thrilled to come to church because it meant she got to see people and get out of her fortress of solitude. But then when she got here, she was a little bit nervous. And I didn't come up and speak. I told George I didn't really have any negative parts of coronavirus to talk about. Everyone had these deep issues, and to me, I felt like things didn't change too much for me because I already had a lot of work that I did remotely. So I was already doing remote work. I already was closed off. And then because of us being shut down here, it meant that now I had even more work because I was working on the services. So then I was just even busier. Everyone else was just doing nothing. And then the parts that did impact me were the things I like. I hate shaking hands. I'm glad that's dead now. But that went away. So I was like, great, and some of the other things that I don't like doing were also gone. And I was like, okay, this is good. So coronavirus was good to me, so far anyway. And And I was busy. And then I didn't need a reason to go to any stores, and I loved going to parks and hiking and walking and traveling, and that was all you could do. And so I got to do more of that. And so it was great. And I couldn't come up on stage when all of them were talking about their negative effects, and I couldn't come up here and be like, it's great. I love it, because that would be the wrong perspective. But I started thinking later, there was one big negative side that did hit me, and that was social media. See, I felt like during that time, there was so much hate and so many disagreements on there that I stepped away and I took a break from it some. And the only thing I ever kept online for was, church and work-related feeds. And I wouldn't go on there personally. And then I would go back to it, a few weeks later, and I wasn't sure. I was like, okay, I don't know if it's because I've been gone for a while that now I'm soft, or if things have gotten worse, but I just had so much heartache going through these feeds and seeing just people say all of these different opinions and saying all these different things from both sides of everything, of every matter, of every argument, and it hurt me. It hurt me on a level that as a being someone so into perspective, I had to look at it and be like, well, can't you see this side of it? Can't you see that side of it? And that hurt me a lot. And I always wonder, with the perspective of ourselves, what do people think about us the most? Do they see us as, strong Christians? Do they see us by our social media posts? Do they know more about our political beliefs than our religious beliefs? And all too often I talk to people, and I'm always curious about, their upbringing and their faith. And a lot of the people that I know that have negative opinions about Christians and people that follow Jesus, it's because they were wronged in some way by someone. A lot of times they have a story about, being in church or a family member being in church and then being, kicked out or having gossip or having some kind of drama happen. And a lot of times we don't account for that side of things. We don't look at someone and think about what they might have gone through. We think maybe they hate us for no reason, instead of thinking, well, maybe something did happen, and maybe that's something now that we have to redeem. Maybe that's now something that we have to really push forward, and instead of just trying to get people to understand who we really are, we need to get them to understand who Jesus is. That if we're doing everything right, sometimes there's still going to be the wrong perspective, and that's why we have to communicate with each other. It's why we have to learn more about each other so that we can understand both sides of every story. But we also really have to get in tune with God's perspective. I want you to think about right now, what's your current perspective of God? What's been your worst perspective of God? And maybe right now you're in a dark time of your life, and maybe the answer is the same for both. I'll be honest with you, this year I haven't really had a negative perspective of God per se, but it's been a harder one because last year we read the Bible cover to cover, and when we did it, it was a mix. Each day it was a mix of New Testament and Old Testament. And that balance was great for me because, I would read about, all the stuff going on in the Old Testament, and then it would get redeemed in the New Testament, and I would hear all the great stuff. But this year, it's just been chronological, going from Genesis all the way. And we just now got to the New Testament in, I think it was October 1st, right? And that meant all of that until then, it was just hard on me trying to read it because I felt like you were either reading a list of names or you were reading the same building plan for the 10th time, or you were just reading about violence and killing and war and promises, being broken, and the Israelites failing for the 100th time. And don't get me wrong, there are beautiful parts of that story because even though the Israelites mess up so much, God still is saying, you're still my chosen people, and I still have a promise set for you, and I still have, the king coming down this line of David. But it was so hard on me to read this because I'm saying, man, how can this be the same God in the Old Testament and the New Testament? And it is, and that's something that I struggle with sometimes. And so reading it, I would just, I would get so discouraged. I'm like, man, I've got to read other parts of the Bible because I have to remember that God still wins in the end. I got to remember that even though these troubles are happening, that he is still here, and he is still loving, and he still forgives, and he still serves, and he still creates new life in us. And so I want you to think about what is your current perspective of God and what's been your worst perspective of God, because a lot of times we switch around with how we view him. If life is good, God is good, right? If life is doing great, we're like, God is so loving, God is so gracious, he gives us grace and mercy. And then when things aren't looking so good, God is vengeful and God is just. God's all of those things at the same time because God is constant. And we need to remember that he is always the same. See, the problem with changing our perception of him is that God is the same yesterday and today. So the minute we change our perspective, it's a wrong perspective. Because God is always going to be the same, and he's always going to have the same values and the same adjectives about himself, that our perception of him needs to remain constant because God is constant. We must align our perception with him instead of with the world's. And see, this is going to come into practice of constantly being in his word, constantly reading, constantly studying, constantly praying, because we cannot have the perspective of God if we are not living in the presence of God. I should have put that in the slides because I feel like that was pretty good. We must align our perception with him instead of with the world's. All too often we get caught up in what the world has to say about God. We get caught up in what the world has to say about Christians, and we start thinking all of these different thoughts. But we have to spend more time with him so we can align what we view him as the same of what he truly is. And we have to align what we view about ourselves with how God views us. We have to remember how he sees us in this right perspective. And we have to set our minds on things above. Colossians 3:2. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. We've talked a lot lately about being rooted in Christ, about having our roots upward, about being on the right plane. And being on the right plane is important. It helps us gain the truest perspective that we can have, that we can start looking at situations and we can reframe them to one that fits God. Because, see, God knows so much more than we do. I always like the analogy of trying to explain all of the mind and presence of God, of how we can go and we can get a cup and we can fill the cup of water from the ocean. We can go into the ocean, we can fill it up, and that's what we have. But we can't say that's the ocean, right? It's just a cup full of water from the ocean. And it's the same thing with what we know about God. It's not all that God is. That we can fill our minds full of all of these things and we can know more and true things about him, but that does not mean that that's everything about God. God's mind and God's matter goes far beyond our own perception of him, and that's something that we have to realize. And that's something that when I'm reading through the Old Testament, I have to remember, well, there's a lot more going on here than I even can fathom. Well, that we have to align our perspective with him. And so I'm going to wrap up now, and I just want you to review some of those questions that we did earlier. I should have put a slide together with all of them on the same page, but I finished these this morning at like 1 a.m. I don't know. I knew about me speaking for the longest, and what happens? I don't know. I go and I start doing more and more things, and we're going to talk about that in my session later about creativity, about how sometimes it causes us to go and work on multiple projects at the same time, but I'm going to put that in a good light, because now it's just making excuses. But today I just want to remind you to be aware that you do not know the full story. You don't know everything about God, that God is so much more than we can ever fathom, that we can ever understand. And you don't know the story of another person. You don't know where they've been and what they've experienced. But maybe you should try. Maybe you should try to understand what they're about and why they think the way they think, because it is so easy for us to give ourselves slack and not someone else. It's so easy for us to just try to gain all the grace we can get instead of actually looking at other people and giving them grace just as God calls us to do. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, Trevor. Mr. Jenkins, thank you so much. Mr. Jenkins. So we're now going to take a break. We're going to have lunch, and we'll be back online at about 1:45 we'll have our worship session, and then we'll have our next breakout sessions. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for hanging out, and we'll make our way back to the cafe area. Just be aware that they may not be finished with their session in there